Hello, everybody. Welcome to Automation Hour. If you're joining us for the first time, all lines are muted. Please post your questions to the Trailblazer Community Salesforce Automation Hour. We will be posting the link to the recording as well as the deck sometime after the session. Right? And we are fully booked out through the end of July. So if you haven't registered, I highly encourage you to register. Even if you can't join us live, you'll know when the links to the recordings are posted after the fact. And I do want to point out in February, we have my co-host David and Rakesh coming back to present on the 7th and the 28th. And we cannot bring our free webinar series to you without our sponsor, Concrete.io. So thank you for sponsoring us. And here are your co-hosts, myself, David, and Rakesh. This was from last year's Midwest Dreamin'. And I am going to hand over presenter rights to Shannon Hale. We are very excited to have both Shannon Hale and Jason Teller on today to share with us the awesome Spring 20 process automation features that they have coming up. So with that, I will hand it off to Shannon.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks for having us back. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Well, welcome everybody to this second edition of your top flow questions answered, the Spring 20 edition with myself and Jason Teller. You can find me on Twitter at Shannon Sands, and one of these days we will convince Jason to get a Twitter account, right, Jason?
Yes, the Twitters are fascinating. I've been observing them for a long time.
So I am Senior Director of Product on the Flow Builder side. Jason?
I am Senior Director of Product on the Flow and Process Engine side.
And forgive us if we're not quite as smooth as we normally are with these transitions. I'm dialing into you all from Calgary today, while Jason is in the office in San Francisco, so we don't have that sort of handoff that we normally have. So, of course, since this is an official visit from the Salesforce folk, we have to tell you about our forward-looking statement. Please make all purchasing decisions based on existing functionality. We may be talking about some future stuff. Most of what we're going to present is existing functionality, but of course, questions come up. We may have a roadmap slide or roadmap question or two. So keep that in mind. So we had another big release for Flow in Spring 20. We have a lot of really fabulous new features like the record change trigger, which Jason is going to talk about in a minute. We had opportunity contract roles showing up in Process Builder, which is a big one, especially for nonprofit folks. And we have a few things for next best action. And I think the best thing that we can do here is really just jump right into the demo and show you some of the great stuff that we've got going on. So I'm just going to do that. So if you've used Flow for a while, you might have a situation like this where you create a new record at some point in the flow based on a bunch of information from another record. Maybe you're creating a project from an opportunity, maybe you're creating a work order from a case or some kind of other maintenance request. And so what you may have is something like this, where you have the original record. In this case, we're creating an employee record from an applicant record for an HR tracker. And when we have the applicant record, we're getting a whole bunch of information off of the applicant record. And then when we're done, we are going to create an employee record, and we're going to pass a lot of that information over there. And don't ask me what all those little red marks are. I'm sure it's fine. So one of the things that happens when in a situation like this is, depending on how many fields you have, it can take a while for you to actually specify every single field in the list. And so what I'm really excited, this is probably my favorite feature in Spring 20, definitely filing under the quality of life features, is that in Spring 20, we have a new feature which is called automatic variable or automatic field detection. We have too many automatics in the automation hour today. And what that means is when you do a get records, we're going to say get applicant. We're going to get an applicant record here. We're going to say when the ID is equal to record ID, we're going to call this from a quick action. So obviously the record ID is going to get passed in automatically, and we'll map that to our ID field. We now have an option from at the bottom of the get records here where we have the option to automatically store all the fields, to manually choose all the fields, and then let Salesforce store the value in an automatic variable, output variable, or to choose the fields and also to assign the value to a variable. Now you might remember that we did this automatic variable mapping in winter for get records, and also for screen components. In spring, we have added automatic variable mapping to actions and also to create records. So that's just one more place where you don't have to go off and create variables. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and automatically store all the fields. And so what this means is that when I'm done here, I don't actually have to go and specify that I want the first name, last name, name, employee, all of those fields that we saw before. And I've pre-created a screen here just so I can run the demo later. So we're just going to hook that up. And now what we're going to do is we're going to do a create records. And this is where we're going to create our employee. We're going to use separate resources and literal values, and we're going to create an employee record. So there's a couple of things I want to show you here. I'm not going to do all the fields. The first thing is that we will notice that we can set the, we're going to go ahead and set the name of the employee. The first thing that we'll notice is that when we look for applicant from get applicant, we see all of the fields that are normally on at get applicant, and we can just go ahead and type get applicant got name. So normally I would have had to, back in my get records, actually chosen the name field and all the other fields that I wanted to map, and I don't have to do that anymore, which is huge, right? That's one of the most time-consuming parts of getting data, is having to specify all those fields. And so what happens here is Flow just automatically figures out which fields I used and queries them when it runs the flow at runtime, and I don't actually have to manually specify those anymore. So that's really a huge time saver. The second thing that I want to show here is that for the applicant here, or for the employee record, we're going to assume that the department for the new employee record is going to be the same as the hiring manager's department. And this is where I get to show one of my other favorite features, which is that you can now traverse to parent records to get values. So in this case, we have the applicant record, we have the hiring manager, and you'll notice that just like in the formula field picker and other places, I can now traverse to the hiring manager record and get the department from that record. Now, we don't actually have to use automatic variables or automatic field detection to use this. As long as you actually specified in your get records that you wanted that hiring manager record, then all of the additional levels of traversal would be fine. So I can go in here and I can get hiring managers department. I can go up multiple levels and so on. So when I click done here, let me hook this up. We go ahead and save it and activate it. If I go back to the recently viewed applicants here, here's Jay. You can see their hiring manager is Desi. If I go into Jay's record and I click the accept offer button here, there's nothing on the screen other than a hey, congrats on your new hire. Obviously, we would probably put a bit more information on here, but for the purposes of this demo, we're keeping it lean. I click next. And now if I go to the employees, we can see that Jay has been created as an employee. and the department didn't get populated because it's a live demo, and for some reason it didn't work. I got so much further than I got in release readiness. Let's just go and take a quick look here. What might I have done wrong? Ah, I did not actually save what I thought I saved. And Jen, I know you mentioned this to me recently, and I have not been able to reproduce it until now, but apparently I just reproduced it. All right. And click done and verify that it actually populated that time. Yes, it did. All right. Save as a new version and activate that. We'll go and delete this particular employee record. And we're going to go back and try this again. We're going to go to J. We're going to accept the offer. And when we go over to employees and we look at J, we can now see that their department is marketing, which is great. The one other thing that I wanted to talk about as far as quality of life issues in Flow Builder this time, you'll notice that we now also have a deactivate action right within the builder. We got in activate last time, which is usually what people really want because you're building and activating, but now we can also deactivate it. And the one other thing I want to show you is that if I were to add, say, Shannon built this in my Get Records applicant. So in the manager, you may recall that this can get kind of long. If we look at the one for this other flow that I've got here, which is considerably more involved, it gets really long. And up until spring 20, the only thing you were able to search on was actually the API name of your various fields. And so if I had called this something other than get applicant, but the API name was get applicant, I couldn't actually search for any other text. But now, if we start typing Shannon, we will see that the applicant from get applicant and the get applicant get records element both show up because we are now searching not only the API name, but also the label and the description. So now if you have things that you need to search for, you can actually search by those things as well. And that is it for my demo. Hey, Jen, shall we check in any questions for the first part?
All right, let me just quickly check.
And if you don't have any questions yet, we can also look at them a little later on, but I figured I would check for now.
I do not see any questions on the first part, so
That
we
is
can
because
proceed.
I described everything so clearly that you have no questions. Wow, I am great. Jason, I am going to go
Hello.
ahead and change presenter to you.
Okay.
If I can find you. Oh my goodness. There are a lot of people in this list. All right.
I have been made presenter. Okay. You guys see my screen?
Yes.
Cool. Thank you, Shannon. So what I'm going to be talking about first off is something that is a Flow exclusive. It's something that we haven't been talking about before. In fact, we didn't talk about it in the Release Readiness Live, but it is actually part of our Spring 20 release. So this little Easter egg is the fact that you can now do pinned custom list views in the Flow list here. So if you see, I have a list view that I created. I go to all flows, which is not my pinned version. And if I refresh, I am back to my filtered down list of the flow that is specific for today's demo. So there you go. Pinned list views inside the flow list. Really great improvement for Spring 20. And yeah, this, you heard it here first. So this is yours, Jen.
That might be my second favorite feature this release now, Jason.
Thank you. That's good to hear. So what I'm going to be talking about is record before save updates, otherwise known as fast field updates. It's something that we introduced in our Spring 20 release, and it's pretty huge. It's really huge because it's very high performance. It's actually 10x faster than any process builder updates. And in fact, it's actually about 10x or so faster than any workflow rule updates that you could do as well. So we highly recommend using this if you're going to do any sort of field updates. So let's take a look at one of these flows here. I created this in advance so you guys can take a look at how it works. It's called the shave ice flow. For those of you who've seen some of my RL demonstrations, I like to talk about Hawaiian desserts. And one of the really famous ones is Hawaiian shave ice. So here I've actually put in a couple of different variations on Hawaiian shave ice as a before save update to account. So if I take a look here, basically to do a before save update, I just choose, it's an auto launch flow, and then I choose the flow trigger, new or update records. I decided to choose record is created or updated, and then I put it on account. So that's the trigger. That means that anytime an account record is created or updated, it'll go ahead and run this particular flow. As you can see here, there's a limited number of things you can do with this particular flow, and that's because it really is specifically designed around doing field updates. Why is that the case? Well, it's because we found that over 50+% of the process builder processes that are out there are actually doing field updates. And in fact, the number is even larger for workflow rules with its field updates as well. And that actually happens to be the one place where we can generate huge performance gains by actually using a before save update in the save order. There are other actions you could potentially do with before save, but you don't actually win in terms of performance by doing that. And so we decided to make this functionality very specific to doing field updates so that you can get all those performance benefits. So as such, you have the ability to actually do a decision and then you do an assignment. So in this decision here, for example, I'm talking about 3 different types of shave ice that you could potentially get. There's rainbow shave ice, which frankly is pretty boring. I would not recommend getting rainbow shave ice, but for some reason it's associated with shave ice. You get rainbow shave ice in most parts of the country. Actually tastes completely different than you would in Hawaii, but honestly, like, I don't know why anybody gets rainbow shave ice. Shannon, do you get rainbow shave ice?
I have never had rainbow shave ice.
Well, that's a good thing. I would highly recommend that nobody actually have rainbow shave ice. It looks cool, it sells well, but seriously, I mean, you can do a lot better than rainbow shave ice.
Although,
So
to be honest, I've only ever actually been to Hawaii once.
Well, see, we have to do better on that one, Shannon. You definitely, I think Hawaii is definitely worth more than one visit, for sure.
I think you're probably right. Hey, maybe next time we do automation hour, we can do it together from Hawaii.
That would be pretty cool. I think that's a good idea. Automation hour in Hawaii. We'll have to look into that. What do you think, Jen?
I want to come.
Maybe we
I'm on board.
On a shave ice stand in Hawaii. We can show you about that. That would be pretty cool. So I went ahead and said in this decision, if it's rainbow selection, to go ahead and make assignments to update my record for rainbow to true in that field in the account. And then similarly, if I do a mochi bowl, for those of you who don't know, a mochi bowl is basically shave ice with Japanese little mochi balls on top. So if I do a mochi bowl as my selection, then basically I'm going to not only put mochi balls on top, but I also need black sugar. If you guys aren't familiar with black sugar, it's a whole amazing world of amazing taste and flavor. Jenny, have you ever heard of black sugar?
I have not.
You have not heard of black sugar. You should definitely check out black sugar. It's used in a lot of flavoring for Asian desserts. It's really, really good stuff. And then, of course, condensed milk. You can, like, pretty much half the dessert world when it comes to the Pacific uses condensed milk in their desserts. So you put all these things on top of shave ice, and you have a really, really great shave ice dessert. And then finally, sour plum, which is also something that came over from Asia to Hawaii. So if you select sour plum, we're going to go ahead and make assignments here to add plum juice as well as condensed milk, because like I said, you can't have a Pacific Rim dessert without condensed milk on top of your shave ice as well. So 3 different selections.
I'm really beginning to wish that I had eaten before this webinar. Why do you do this to me every time, Jason?
Just to whet the appetite. That's the whole point. We're trying to whet the appetite for flow.
But I'm in Calgary and I'm not going to be able to find shaved ice anywhere. except maybe in the backyard.
Exactly. And then finally, if I can't actually do any of these things, I being lazy, this is a demo, I probably wouldn't suggest this, but I'm gonna go ahead and set everything back to null. So that way I can go ahead and rerun the demo and show you how everything works here. So this is an interesting pattern where basically it's not just one thing, but depending on what outcome you want, you do the other sorts of things. So there was a question that sort of came up in terms of, can you do some ordering here? And this is kind of a way of doing some ordering. The before save update triggers actually, individual triggers don't necessarily have an order to them. So it's something to take in consideration when you're actually building your before save updates. So let's take a look. Yeah.
Before you go any further, I have a question. So if I happen to be slightly eccentric and I really wanted rainbow and mochi ball, would I be able to do that?
You would be able to if you would actually have to make the assignment for the rainbow mochi ball as an outcome here.
Okay.
One of the things that we're actually double checking on is the chaining possibilities, but I'll have to get back to you on that.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, back to here. So it is about shave ice. Thank you. That's cool. So this is what I have in terms of my setup. I have a selection here, and what we're going to try to do is see for each one of these selections I make the respective ingredients that actually need to go in there. And I've isolated rainbow to a single ingredient because seriously, you should never be picking rainbow. But let's just say, for example, that you were to make a poor choice and pick rainbow. Then we will go ahead, and as you can see here, it has made the update almost immediately to rainbow. That was pretty quick. I can, whoa, what happened there? There we go. Go ahead and save, erase everything. This is the default that I did, which I don't necessarily recommend. But as you can see, anytime I select one, it will go ahead and make the proper ingredient selections based on the assignments that I've done. So essentially, we're doing field updates, right? These are default false. We're changing them to true with the flow inside of Flow Builder, leveraging these assignment nodes. So it's a little odd because I think a lot of people would expect to use, say, an update records or something like that. Due to the nature of how before save updates work, the assignment node was actually the best way to sort of demonstrate that you just assign a particular value and then it gets sucked into the before save. The update records are designed around the actual database operations that happen later in the save order. Speaking of which, Shannon, has the have the Twitters talked about where we are in the save order now with before save?
There was a little bit of Twitter chatter about where we are in the before save order of execution during the Flow Release Readiness Live webinar.
Oh, cool. And where are we?
We are now number 3 on the charts.
With a vengeance.
Yes.
Going, we could be number 1.
I don't think we can be number 1 because number 1 is basically when we actually check for field requiredness and potentially any page layout requiredness that happens. So I think we are number 2 is probably the best we can hope for, but number 3 is pretty good. I mean, we're actually happening even before triggers now.
That's correct. Before triggers, but I'm holding out hope that when Flow takes over all of Salesforce, we could be number 1.
We're number 1. No, never mind.
So yeah, that's basically the change here. And as you can see, it makes all the different changes with the before save updates. And I'm actually going to go ahead and pause on the before save before I move to the next one, see if there's any additional questions there.
Okay, let me just do a quick check through.
You can check on the Trailblazer community because I'm redirecting everyone to post questions there so we can track.
Yeah, okay. Right, so on the Trailblazer community, how come there is no search yet in the Flow list view?
That's a good question. Okay, so it's a slightly more involved answer. It's not necessarily a great answer, but it is a very, it is the reality of what we're working with here. So most searches that you're used to actually happen in a in a list view that's in a Salesforce app somewhere. Each one of those particular lists are backed by an individual object with a set of records that's inside the database. So you're essentially searching against that particular table. You're actually searching against data in those cases. Most search functionality out there is designed to search against data, which is, kind of makes sense. When you're actually in the flow list view in setup, you're not searching against data. You're actually searching against metadata. You're searching against the definition of a flow that is actually in our system. And not only that, but we're combining two different kinds of flow definitions. We're now, with the new flows list view, supporting standard flows, which are flow definitions that are actually written by Salesforce, as well as custom flows, which are flow definitions that are written by everybody in our community. And both of these are actually metadata, not actual data. So to actually write a search that that works with both of those things is actually, I'm just going to say it's pretty challenging. It's something that we had actually hoped to do originally with the list view, but unfortunately, we weren't able to get it to function in a way that we thought would satisfy, well, frankly, just what you would expect a search to do, just based on that alone. So it is something that we are aware of. I cannot, unfortunately, give you much of a timeline around this because it's just not something that search is really designed to do, frankly. If we are able to get search in a place where it can easily go through the different fields, et cetera, in the metadata in Salesforce, then we can certainly support this. But in the meantime, we're sort of banking on the combination of the custom list view that I showed you here, as well as if you create one of those, you can go ahead and edit the filters, et cetera, to actually get it to this point. So that's kind of how I did it here, right? I actually said that I want to have all my flows that contain shave ice to actually be in this particular list view, and then it showed me all of those. So it is additional steps to actually do it, but that can actually work for you.
Great. Regarding fast fields updates, is this just Process Builder in Flow?
Well, it's not Process Builder in Flow because Process Builder doesn't do before save updates. One of the things that we did here was to introduce this functionality in Flow because we had to restrict down the actual capabilities that you could have, and in Flow we could actually do that, down to these specific nodes that are right here. In general, our idea here is that we've received a lot of feedback that customers and users and admins, et cetera, trailblazers, everybody, they don't like the idea of having to use two different tools, right? If you're calling Flow from triggers and Process Builder, then you're going between Process Builder and Flow to actually get your work done. So we're introducing these triggers in Flow because Flow is a great platform to be building with, and not having that trigger capability inside of Flow didn't make a lot of sense. And so that's why we're focusing on these different triggers. If you remember last release, we had the scheduled Flow trigger, and now we're adding the before save update Flow trigger as well inside of Flow here.
Great. Another question, for before save flows, what can we generally expect to be available on such records? Record type, yes or no? Owner ID, yes or no? Are there things we can generally assume will not be happy, such as formula fields, but other things we could assume will be happy?
I'm not sure I totally understand the question. I mean, if it's a field that can be updated, then you can go ahead and make that update inside the before save.
The fields that won't be available initially are things like record ID, because this happens before the record's actually committed to the database, and
Right.
things like created date, because it hasn't actually been created yet. And so that's actually something you can use to your advantage. We don't have is new yet in the formulas in Flow Builder, but what you can do is you can do a check for whether $record.id is set, and if it's null, then that means it's a new record as compared to a updated record.
Right. Actually, that's a good point. I should point this out, and I forgot to in the demo. The dollar record is something that's pretty. It is something we actually introduced with the schedule triggers, but it's pretty vital here. Like basically, with the before save update, the update will happen on the record that triggered the update. Right. So that's the design. And so by specifying dollar record here, I am saying use the record that triggered the update, and then this is the field that I'm actually setting on that record.
So if you used get records here and you set use the record that you retrieved in an assignment, that doesn't get updated.
Correct. And I was about to go into that after the questions. Basically, we included both like the loop and the get records here because sometimes you want to make an update on the triggering record with information that might be from another record. And so we gave you a few of the manipulation capabilities here to get that record information, possibly loop through it if there's a collection variable, something like involved, some more complex logic. But ultimately, this feature will essentially only do updates to the triggering record, with particular values, which could be referenced from somewhere else. But that's basically what the feature does with the fast field update.
And do you have on like the near term roadmap the ability to update related records?
It's a good question. So again, the before save update is very specifically designed to updating the fields on the triggering record, and that's because all the performance benefits come in that particular scenario. If you start navigating to related records, one, you're going to end up with potential conflicts in the save order. So, for those who understand the save order, that hopefully made sense. Because it might be triggering or causing other things as a result of other things that happen in the save order. So with this before save update, with the third place in the save order, very specific set of functionality that you can do that. Now, that all being said, I'm going to refer to Shannon's earlier safe harbor slide. It is on our roadmap to look at supporting after save triggers, which function much more similarly to your sort of process builder trigger or your workflow rules type trigger. And in those cases, then you would be able to, do much more functionality, pretty much all the flow functionality. I think that's something we're also kind of teasing out, and that would function, like as you expect with related records, etc. But it would be after the save, and so the performance would not be as fast as these before save updates.
Another question, if these before update flow actions happen before triggers, would it affect the result of whether a trigger might fire?
Rigor. So it depends on the before trigger, I guess, is the answer. That's something you'd probably have to test.
Do you want me to continue on reading the questions, or did you want to continue on with the presentation and we loop back with the questions?
Why don't we go ahead? Yeah, I only had one more quick thing, and then we could go back into we have a couple of slide tips, and maybe some of the questions will be answered there, and then we can finish it off.
Okay.
So the other, so let's do that. The other feature that we introduced, which I don't have a full demo for, but I'll show you where it is because I think that wasn't necessarily clear for some folks, is the ability to actually run flows as system or in system context. So basically, when you go to save a flow and you look at the advanced settings here, you can have the option here of how to run the flow. So you can either go with how the flow is actually being launched, i.e. flows in general are run as with the permissions as the user that actually launched them, or you can actually have here the ability to run it as system context with sharing in this particular case. I just wanted to point that out. Another big feature we had for a release, which we've covered like in RL and whatnot, was actually being able to run flows in a system context. And I think Tim in our flow special live RRL, Tim Pang, our PM who designed this feature, went through a lot of great scenarios around that, but I wanted to make sure everybody was aware that's how you do the setting. So I think that's it for my demo. I'll pass it back to Shannon for the rest of the slides. You're right, Shannon, that is a long list.
If you start typing my name, you can find it.
Okay. Ah, there it is.
There we go. All right, back to me.
Yep.
So just before I go into the follow-up slides, whoops, no, I don't want to share, I want to present. Yeah, the one other thing that I did want to call out was that one of the things you might have noticed if you have a Spring 20 in your org is that Cloudflow Designer is largely no more. So everyone should be on Flow Builder at this point. Adobe is end of life in Flash this year, and so alas, it has served us well, but it is time to say goodbye to our old friend, the Flash Designer. And we can all light a candle for it. So we wanted to call it a couple of tips for the various features that we showed. For cross-object references, when you do get records with manually selected fields, you can still use traversals, but you want to make sure that you include the first level. So for example, if you were on an account and you wanted to go to account.createdby.manager.email, you would want to make sure that you included the created by ID field in your query. If you do automatic automatic field detection, darn it, then you'll get all that automatically. But if you do want to use manual fields, then you can do it that way. And that's largely because we realize that it's not always feasible for you to go back and rework your existing flows. So if you do need to make adjustments and you don't want to go back and basically turn on the automatic field detection and then rework all of the downstream elements that we're referring to those fields, you can still get to it this way. You cannot assign values to the traversed fields, so you couldn't say created by .manager.email equals my email address, but you can use them in the right-hand side of assignments, as we saw, and you can also use them in the left-hand side of decisions. So if I wanted to check and see perhaps what if I was on a contact and I wanted to see what contact.account.industry was and do something with the account based on that, I can do that. The one exception for that is that in the, I believe, and maybe Jason, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that we do not actually allow field reversal in the before save when we're doing before save triggers.
I think that's correct, yeah.
But for other occasions, you should be able to use it. Traversals in this way don't count against your DML limits, so you're not making a query. And if you do happen to try to go to, for example, say, I'm trying to think about something where things are optional. Say you have a contact field on an opportunity and you tried to go to opportunity.contact and contact was null, then you'll get null. It won't throw an error. But that is dependent on an important critical update, which is coming out, which come out in Spring 20 and is being enforced, which is that when we do when we reference lookups, we will automatically return null for lookups for fields on that lookup if the lookup is unavailable. So if contact wasn't set and you tried to do contact.email, you would get null instead of an error. And I believe that is being enforced starting in February or March. I recommend that you check out the release notes because there's a couple of critical updates that are being enforced and a few other new ones that are being introduced. Automatic field detection. I saw in the questions someone had asked if this was going to impact performance, and it doesn't, because only fields that are used later in the flow actually get queried at runtime. We don't actually look for everything. The one exception is that if you pass your the variable that you got when you did the get records, if you pass that record into a subflow or into an action, then we do actually have to query all the fields because we don't know which fields are used by the subflow or action. So sometimes you actually want that behavior. I know I saw something on the automation automation chatter group where someone was basically doing a clone and actually did want to get all the fields, but didn't want to have to request them manually. So by putting them into a subflow, they were able to do that. That's just something to be aware of. Jason, do you want to cover this one?
Sure. So a couple of tips that we have around the before save update triggered flows, largely due to sort of feedback we've had since it's been out there and people have had a chance to play with it. The first thing to remember is that you can choose different trigger types when you do this. I would recommend that you choose the trigger type before you add other elements to the canvas, because if you have a bunch of elements that aren't supported before save and you switch back, then you have these elements that are not supported. Whereas if you start with, I'm going to do before save update, you get the reduced set of elements that you can actually use inside a before save update flow. Thing to keep in mind, back to the whole save order, I know it can be a little bit complicated, but the record triggered before save flows will execute before workflow rules and before process builder processes. So you really are sort of going before all of that. So something to keep in mind is that if you have these other rules and process builder processes that are triggering off the same object, then you may need to consider doing, pulling some of that out, or just remember that this is going to happen before those things happen. And since those are downstream, yeah, it could affect the behavior of those processes. And then I think Shannon already pointed this out when we were doing the demo. Because it's happening before save, then the ID will not actually, for this particular record, won't be created yet if it's a new record being created. And so check for the null record ID to detect if that's a new record versus one that you're just updating. And like in my example, I was just doing updates to that particular account record, so I didn't do that particular check, but that's something to keep in mind. So system context, yeah, let's just go ahead and add them all here. So one of the features that we introduced in our winter release was the ability to restrict via profiles and perm sets, like which users could actually run your flow. So we deliberately delivered that before we delivered system context with sharing, because that way you can ensure that not only do you have the ability to set profiles and perm sets for flows, but you can restrict who can use system context based on the profiles and perm sets that we set up in winter. So it's a good idea from a security perspective to sort of lock down who can actually leverage a flow via system context. So that's our tip there for system context. And then similarly, you can actually control this escalation of privilege, this ability to use system context with subflows as well. So something else to kind of keep in mind, system context is very powerful. So therefore, the more control you have over it, typically the better off you are in terms of knowing how and where it's being run. And then the final tip here, of course, is that system context is not God. It's not God mode. You can't do everything. I think I'm not going to cover all the big ones here, but the ones I often get questions around are about, what about validation rules? System context is actually being in this way, is another way of thinking about it is taking a user and escalating their permissions, their ability to do things, right? And so in those cases, you have higher permissions or higher levels of access than you would otherwise as a user, but it doesn't mean that you can't circumvent validation rules, because those happen separately, from this sort of usage around system context. So I get that question pretty often, and so no, you don't circumvent the validation rules when you can actually do that. And that's often because validation rules are associated with the accuracy and cleanliness of data that actually gets to the system. And so if you were to have that ability and the person who wrote the validation rule wasn't aware of it, then you're now actually changing the expected values of data that are actually in the system, which can muck with a lot of things, in terms of just usage and reporting and other things in that system. So the pattern, if you do want to have something that can actually not trigger a validation rule, is to actually bake that exception into the validation rule itself. So I'm going to run something in system context. It's going to set this particular flag on a record, or it'll make this setting on the record. And the validation rule will check for that setting and say, okay, if that is actually set, then go ahead and, you don't need to actually trigger that validation rule. So that's sort of the pattern that would make more sense in that case, because you ensure that the data is what is expected when it gets into the database itself. So yeah, system context.
All right. Whoops. So learning more about flow. We have a couple of great trailhead trails, the build flows with Flow Builder and automate your business process with Lightning Flow trails. We have a series of tutorials that were posted on the Salesforce admins blog that were done by Alex Edelstein. We are planning on updating these. We did these right when we rolled out Flow Builder, which is unbelievably a year ago. And so a lot of things have changed since then, and we'll be updating all those videos pretty soon. And then the last one, Flow Solutions on App Exchange. We have a whole bunch of new templates that have been uploaded from Salesforce Labs that give you insights into how to build some of these flows and that are free. So you should definitely check those out if you're trying to learn more about flow and see how people build things. And I think with that, we are just ready for more questions, Jen.
Great, and we do have many. All right,
bet.
so the first question, I have a few questions and a comment regarding the Flow Builder simplification campaign to converge the tools and enable Flow Builder to meet all the Process Builder use cases. If I am understanding the goal, is it correct to assume that it is in the not too distant future, we may hear that workflow rules and process builder development will slow or even stop, and all future enhancements will only be Flow Builder? Has there been a timeline discussed internally for meeting the goal of this campaign? I have struggled with best practice that has been promoted of using one workflow rule or process per object. It doesn't seem like this would be a similar best practice recommendation when using flows. Can you please provide your thoughts and comments on this topic? And then a comment, please don't phase out the complexity entirely. It would be very helpful if the tool maintained an advanced section for power users.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. I think Jason touched on this a little bit earlier. One of the things that we're trying to do right now is to make it so you don't have to jump from tool to tool to tool when you're doing something more complicated. And that's definitely one of our goals in building a lot of this functionality into Flow Builder. The other thing that we have as an advantage of Flow Builder, which I think we've talked about in a few other places, is debugging is a lot easier in Flow Builder compared to Process Builder. And so some of the stuff that we're doing is definitely focusing in that area in Flow Builder. Obviously, nothing's going to go away in a hurry. Workflow rules are not going away in a hurry, even though we've been telling people to use Process Builder instead of workflow rules for 3 or 4 years now. We've got lots of people who have built workflows and lots of people who have built processes, and we recognize that it's not really feasible to tell you to go back and rebuild everything. So I don't think you have to worry about stuff going away anytime soon. And our roadmap for simplification is still going to take us a while to get through things. One thing that I do like to note about the simplification stuff is that even though we talk about it as simplification, when you look at something like automatic field detection, that's not only a simplification, it's also a huge efficiency win even for power users. So a lot of the stuff that we're looking at really is looking at it with that intent as well. Like when we looked at automatic variable mapping for Lightning components and LWC components, it means that you don't have to create 3 or 4 variables to store the values in. Not only does that save you having to go off and create those, but it also reduces a lot of the cruft in your system because you don't have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 more variables to filter through. So I think in the end, a lot of that is for the best. But yeah, we're not planning on necessarily taking away functionality. But I do think there's a lot of things here that can be still adopted by our power users. You got anything to add, Jason? Oh, I know that was kind of long, although it was a
Yeah,
big question.
that's a good answer, Shannon. I do have a little bit to add here. I mean, the one of the feedback points that we've gotten since this PM sort of group became part of the Flow team is that a lot of people would like to use Flow, and they see these automation hours, they see Jen out there doing these demos and everything, and they just, sounds really great, really awesome. There's all this power in Flow. Flow gives you the ability to do things that only the developer can do, but they try, or they even think about trying it. It's frankly quite intimidating, right? And there's a lot of things that are in Flow that make it intimidating that it don't necessarily have to be there, right? So yes, I mean, obviously variable usage for power users and whatnot makes a lot of sense, and we're not taking that away. But at the same time, like, do you really, like, do we have to do variables, right? Like, you could use something like automatic output to say not have to do a variable if it doesn't really require using a variable, and these types of things. And so most of the flow simplification efforts are really around this idea that, like, if you need to do more than what the current tools, other options are out there, then you should be using Flow, but we need to make sure that that is more approachable for folks. And so that's a lot of what we're doing. And at the same time, we're combining that with the feedback, like I said before, that, people are saying, well, I mean, which tool? I keep jumping around. It's very frustrating. So let's try to make sure that that in combination has what it can be offered, so you don't have to jump around between tools. Like, I go back to my example of process builder calling flows. Like, why is that a necessary thing if most of your logic is going to end up in a flow in the end anyway, right? And so these are sort of the big drivers for a lot of these efforts. And we do have this fancy flow builder that Shannon helped us build, so we're definitely going to be leveraging that and its capabilities as much as we can. To the second half of the question regarding the ordering and the struggle around the workflow rules and the process builder thing, I'm going to say that as of right now, you're not necessarily going to get many benefits, generically speaking, from Flow doing triggers, right? I mean, insofar as, yes, you don't have to use process builder to call Flow, but if you have several flow triggers on an object, well, it's going to be similar, probably a little bit more performant, we hope, than say doing workflow rules or process builder processes against a same object. So the pattern still applies, right? The fact is that everything goes through the save order, and everything is going to happen in a particular order or not, depending on how you specify that, right? So if you're going to want your flow trigger off an object to have a certain amount of logic that happens in a certain sequence, you're going to have to build that in even today, right? That we have not been able to address yet. And I say yet because we're well aware of that issue. One of the things I have on my team's backlog, once we sort of get into the flow trigger pattern, is to say, okay, now how do I actually see for a given object, like, to the degree that I can, as far as flow is concerned, what is going to happen here, and potentially in what order, right? It's not a particularly, unfortunately, it's not a particularly easy thing to do to actually establish order, because the order has many, what's the right term, like layers to it, right? There's the save order, which is difficult enough for people inside of Salesforce to fully grok. So we certainly appreciate how challenging that can be for our customers. And then there's the order of the triggers that we create with our tools within that save order, and then obviously the potential order of those in relation to an object that is actually within that save order as well. And so that isn't necessarily something we can solve in any one tool. In fact, I would imagine the solution, and I'm literally imagining right now because we haven't spec'd anything out yet, likely to happen outside the tools, because it would involve, say, multiple flows. It could involve process builder processes. We don't know just yet, because anything that gets triggered off that object that's related to automation would probably be somehow in that scope, or maybe we'll have to isolate it down to just flow or something like that to make it realistic. It's a very long-winded answer, but I just want to give you a little sense of kind of what we were kind of confronting this particular area. And yeah, I mean, I agree. It's definitely not easy. And so our first step after we do some of this trigger work is to provide you with more visibility, because we definitely acknowledge the frustration, but it is a very, very challenging problem to solve.
Great, thank you both for that answer. All right, the next question, could you repeat what setting was made that caused the limited number of elements to be available?
That is when you do a before save trigger or a before save flow. And the reason for that is that because it all sort of happens before the record is committed to the database, and because we're shooting for performance there, it's pretty much restricted to being able to update the record itself. So it just has assignment and decisions, and then get records in a loop, so that if you do need to reference external records to get some values, they're available. But for the most part, it's a very focused solution.
All right, next question. Can you update this shave ice flow to unchecked values if you chose a different option?
Yes, you can. So basically, in my flow, I set those, I set the assignments to true. If you set them to false, it'll basically uncheck those values.
Great. Another question, does the before update...
The last one, when I said erase, that actually did go through and uncheck all the values. That's what that node actually did, that element did, yeah.
Does the before update flow respect user permissions?
I believe it does. I'll double check on that one.
Okay. Is there a doc on how to use before save to pre-fill record name better than doing an action where we can access a field selected on the fly? For example, in the create record screen, if I selected Joe Smith as a contact, Joe Smith would be seen in the name field before save.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Sure.
I think I get it.
Okay.
So even though it's before save, the before save doesn't happen until which is going to be a little confusing, doesn't actually happen until the user clicks save. And so they're not going to see any changes in the UI at the time that they save it. You could theoretically use it much like you could with a predefined value in a quick action, where you set the value, the name, to be equal to the account name plus the current date or something for the opportunity. But it's still not going to actually impact the UI, because the user still has to click save. The before save really just counts for when it actually gets committed to the database, not when what the UI actually looks like. I think that's what the question was asking.
All right, and I think this will be our last question. Any questions that we didn't get to?
Sorry, I was not correct. It actually does use, it works just like Process Builder, so it elevates the permissions for that user. It's always a little bit tricky, but it'll show as that user, but it does elevate the permissions to essentially the system context for that.
Okay, great. So last question, and anything that we didn't get to, I'd like to ask the two of you to go to our Trailblazer community and answer them if possible. So last question here, can you change ownership of a record with a before save, like from the user to a queue?
Can we change from a user to a queue? We'll have to get back to you on that one. I think so. Yeah, sorry. It's a lot of different permissioning structures around these triggers.
Great. All right, so we are at time. I will mention the two of you on the chatter posts in our Automation Hour Trailblazer community. Thank you again for coming back on and sharing all this awesomeness with us. And you are always welcome to come back again and again and again. And we'll have to schedule that offsite in Hawaii.
Yeah, maybe not for the summer release, maybe for like the next spring release, because you know, sometime when it's colder.
Right.
So winter maybe.
All
Well,
right.
thanks so much for joining us, everybody. And we will, for those who joined late, we will be posting the link to the recording as well as the deck out on automationhour.com, out on our YouTube channel, search on Automation Hour, and on our Trailblazer community, Salesforce Automation Hour. And with that, we will talk to you next time.
Thanks everybody
Bye.
for joining.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Thanks, everyone.